I remember James Bond from my childhood. I remember watching a lot of the older movies on TV, then watching Skyfall, Spectre, and of course No Time to Die in the cinema. I remember the iconography of the gun barrel intro, the Aston Martins, the gadgets, the suits, the shaken not stirred martini, and of course I remember the music. There's no doubt about James Bond being one of the most iconic and recognizable characters of our age, with the movie franchise spanning over 60 years at this point. Counting the books, we're even closing in on the 75th anniversary of the character. But I have to admit, I don't think I ever really cared about Bond that much. The image I got in my head when I think of James Bond is quite outdated. He's not a hero I would feel inspired by or care about. By the end of my teenage years, he wasn't even a character I'd seek out for the fun of it. He merely existed as a part of the cultural zeitgeist, which made watching the new movies somewhat necessary to keep up, but never a necessity out of personal interest. So back in 2020, more than 5 years ago, when IO Interactive announced that they were working on a James Bond video game, I wasn't all too excited about the news, but I still knew that I had to play it, since by that point IO had already become one of my favorite game development studios. I've been a huge fan of IO, not just since I first played the beta of Hitman 2016, I unknowingly already loved another one of their games way before that, when I played and adored Mini Ninjas on my PS3. Mini Ninjas may have been my introduction to stealth in video games. So it's fitting that the stealth games I played the most are the modern Hitman games. Hitman has a unique approach to stealth, with less of a focus on actually evading enemies by hiding behind corners. Instead, there's a bigger focus on environmental puzzle solving, i.e. how to traverse the intricately designed maps and which objects in the environment to use in what way in order to kill your targets in the most efficient way possible. The Hitman games have enchanted me completely, and I knew that I would have to play First Light on good faith in IO Interactive alone, even if just to show support for one of my dearest studios that had a lot of trouble keeping the lights on over the last decade. And I'm happy to say 007 First Light ended up being a really good video game. Over the last couple of years, I've read a lot of people say that IO is the perfect developer for a Bond game, simply because of what they did with the Hitman games. I never really understood this sentiment, since I could not really imagine Bond working in the same kind of environment as Agent 47 from Hitman. But the thing is, he does. The very first gameplay showcase of the game showed this off quite well. Bond on a mission in Slovakia, mingling with high society socialites while investigating a suspicious luggage boy. Here, Bond gets to explore a relatively open building with different paths to take through it. You're able to garner the information about the luggage boy in several ways. You can talk to attendees of the party, you can find clues placed around the map, or you can just explore on your own terms. The game can even lead you down paths that aren't the right one. It's all about gathering enough intel and following up on it. This also leads to traversal challenges, as when Bond has to evade some of his colleagues who are not supposed to know that he left his position outside of the building, or having to get around locked doors by either finding an alternate way around them or finding a way of opening them up. In essence, this is exactly how the Hitman games work. Just like in those games, Bond is tasked to do a thing, and the player gets several different opportunities to execute that task. This allows for some amount of player expression that distracts from the linearity that the game adheres to most of the time. The different opportunities are mostly discovered by listening in on NPCs discussing certain subjects, who are always made visible through icons in the game world. This in turn opens up a small chain of tasks that will eventually lead you toward your main goal of that specific mission. While the Hitman games might ask you to engage with a lot of different game mechanics for these kinds of opportunities, Bond handles things in a more streamlined manner. A lot of times you will have to pickpocket a character, other times you will have to get an item from a guarded area. Most of these things are stupidly easy to do. Enemies can be distracted by using Bond's gadgets and then pickpocketed without having to build up any elaborate scheme. What feels a bit awkward here is that you can even use your gadgets right next to your targets or literally anyone else. Doing this will not cause suspicion and therefore won't interrupt the gameplay flow whatsoever. Suspicion, as a state characters can be in is barely a thing during these segments in the first place. Even when you're caught in an area you're not supposed to be in, the game will simply fade to black and throw you out of that area, simply letting you try again. This is a lot simpler compared to the Hitman games, where any kind of odd action that is noticed by even ordinary NPCs will lead to you being discovered and eventually attacked if you're not careful. First Light does a lot to make its open segments as easy to tackle as possible, which simply makes it hard or even impossible to fail. This is not a complaint, mind you, it's simply a statement. I think IO thought about this a lot and decided that this streamlined approach would work best for both the intended audience of the game, which is presumably a lot wider than Hitman's, but also for Bond himself. Bond is supposed to be cool, so letting him handle things in as brisk and efficient a way possible is simply part of the Bond fantasy. But to be fair, even if it's hard, failing is still possible, even during these Hitman-like exploration segments. Some opportunities will lead you into more secluded areas of the level, which will be guarded by actual security. These are different from the areas where the game fades to black when you're caught, since these ones are filled with actual guards. Where before you'd simply walk into an area you're not allowed to be in, wherein simple employees would throw you out, now you're actually intruding an area that is guarded by actual security personnel. Personnel that you're able to take out in combat, something you're not able to do with the simpler employees. Stealth is encouraged most of the time. Sneaking up on enemies from behind, hiding behind cover, distracting them with either Bond's gadgets or items in the environment, it's all par of the course for light stealth in your average video game. Where it gets more interesting, however, is when Bond is found and has to engage with his enemies. There are several different approaches to this situation. Bond can either bluff his way out of the situation or straight up surrender. Both of these actions require focus, which you can recharge by taking out enemies. Bluffing takes up more focus and can be used to confuse groups of enemies in order to go back into hiding without any escalation of the situation. Surrendering, on the other hand, is only really viable when encountering a single enemy. Enemies will approach Bond as he surrenders, who can then be knocked out as they close in on him. These are the two ways of getting out of these situations mostly unscathed. But if you take too long to do either of these things, enemies will start engaging you in combat, unless you're the one who starts punching first. If you're able to take out enemies who've spotted you before they inform other enemies of your presence, you're able to simply go back to stealth, which might be one of the most lenient but honestly fun stealth mechanics I've ever seen in a game like this. Seeing "situation contained" pop up on the screen is as satisfying as can be. If you're not able to do so in time, your enemies will end up not just calling in reinforcements, but might also start pulling out guns to deal with you, escalating the situation completely. Dying here, of course, fails the mission, which simply means that you'll have to reload from a checkpoint. While these Hitman-like segments are really fun on their own, I'd argue that the game includes too many of them. Toward the end of the game, these segments devolve to a simple "find a way to unlock a door", with increasingly little ways of actually arriving at that goal. This is when it starts to feel like the game is artificially padding out its playtime, while also not offering any meaningful gameplay experience on top of that. The Vietnam segment toward the last third of the game is probably my favorite one of these open-ended sections, but stealing bracelets, lab codes, or unlocking higher security clearance within plain and tiny office environments got seriously grating and uninteresting. They should either have been expanded upon greatly or simply cut out. But while these segments did get grating, it must be said that all of the bigger ones are serious standouts. And while it may not have been my favorite one of these, the one on the left was especially intriguing because it shifted your task to something vaguer.
Moneypenny, I need $100,000.
You know I can't do that, James.
Looks like I'm getting my hands dirty then.
There are many different ways of getting that money within a smallish marketplace. Bond can, for example, join a fight club, cheat a scammer, infiltrate an enemy faction, and steal a crypto wallet. This section has, from what I could tell, the biggest amount of variety in approaches, which makes it perhaps the best showcase for what is possible within the gameplay limitations of First Light. IO managed to apply their MO from their last couple of games to Bond in a very elegant and fitting way, but to my surprise, they took things even further. Another reason for why I didn't necessarily think that IO would be a good fit for Bond is their combat. The combat in the recent Hitman games is very stilted and simply not fun. It's also not really supposed to be, as combat should always be a last resort, if any resort at all. But it's different for Bond. It was clear that a Bond game would have to include sophisticated combat. But I did not have enough faith in IO to believe that they would be able to pull off anything too compelling. But they did. First Light basically consists of two different styles of game, as we already discussed. One of them is very similar to what IO did with Hitman, except more streamlined. And then there's the other style of game. A linear third-person action adventure with a lot of cutscenes, climbing segments, banter between the characters, and, naturally, a lot of action. There are several games that fit the bill for this, of course, but the absolute classic and probably the main inspiration for this game's action theming is Uncharted. First Light is about 30 to 40% Hitman and I'd say 60 to 70% Uncharted. It's almost filled to the brim with bombastic set pieces, high-octane shootouts, messy fistfights and gorgeous locales. First Light structures things pretty clearly. We are usually introduced to a new chapter in a more lengthy walk and talk or drive and talk section, which then opens up into an area with a bigger focus on exploration. And by the end, all hell breaks loose and shootouts are the name of the game. I cannot state enough how incredible the combat in First Light is, and it's no surprise really when you look at who worked on the combat for First Light. Adam Vincent, former combat animator and designer at Rocksteady, and in turn, the Arkham games. From melee brawls that have objects in the environment break from the force with which Bond throws his enemies into walls, over fences, or across desks, to explosive shooting segments with insane destructibility in the environment, a constant fight for cover that urges you to push forward while fluidly switching between CQC and snappy feeling gunplay that reminded me of Quantum Break in its flashiness, except that it feels a lot better. There's a thrill to First Light's combat that is, in my opinion, entirely unique to this game. In a way, it's the perfect John Wick fantasy, with how fluid and improvisational it is. Melee offers a lot of options. Throwing objects in the environment at an enemy will allow Bond to take that enemy out in an instant. Blocking an attack usually opens up the possibility of a counterattack. Bond can dodge out of the way, Bond can grab enemies and punch them while holding onto them, the grab can be used to throw enemies into specific directions, and holding the grab button allows Bond to dash into a direction with an enemy in hand. There are even different combos when simply punching your enemies, which includes kicks or punches to the gut. Combos that I was not aware of until I went back to play some additional optional content after the end of the game that tutorialized the fighting mechanics further. It's not just that all of this feels great to perform, it's also that it looks good, which in turn makes it feel good, I suppose. The animations are fluid and have a lot of impact. They are incredibly snappy, which makes each attack feel satisfying, and the overall movement leads to the fights feeling like actual brawls. Transitioning from throwing a guy over a fence and having him plunge into his death, to rushing into the next enemy and knocking his head against the wall, and having complete control over what you're doing is incredible work. And while melee is fun enough on its own, it gets even more interesting when gunplay is added into the mix. Gunplay is similarly snappy to the melee combat. Pulling off headshots feels great and guns feel suitably powerful. The thing is though, shooting segments barely just consist of shooting. They're a mixture of taking out enemies with guns, transitioning to melee, or using Bond's gadgets to use objects in the environment to his advantage. Ammo is scarce, and most of the cover in the game is destructible, so Bond usually has to keep running. Slowing down time with his focus ability makes performing headshots easier, as combat is usually very hectic, and allows Bond to take out enemies even while running for cover. Once Bond is out of ammo, he is able to throw an empty weapon at an enemy, opening them up for an immediate takedown, which then usually makes Bond pick up that enemy's weapon automatically. Picking up weapons off the ground while running has Bond kick up the weapons toward him with the slick animation. Bond is also able to shoot guns out of enemies' hands or shoot at their legs in order to perform takedowns. Leon S. Kennedy would be proud. On top of all this, there are usually tons of explosive barrels or the like in the environment, which can make whole parts of the environment collapse, as well as several objects that Bond can hack or destroy, which could, for example, make enemies fly off a bridge or have boxes knock out enemies by falling on them. I've already said it and I will say it again, First Light's combat is amazing. It's a real shame though, and another parallel to Uncharted, Uncharted 4 specifically, that there aren't really enough segments in the game that take advantage of this shooting gameplay. Stealth is either too common, or there are just not enough areas where shooting seems like the best course of action. A lot of the time, the game will introduce you to a possible combat section from a safe position, meaning that Bond has not yet been fully discovered, which in turn allows him to take out guards stealthily or simply evade them completely. Sure, I could always have gone for the simple solution and shot my way through, but I don't feel like the game encouraged me enough in this. And trying to get through an area without being spotted offered a different kind of challenge that was thrilling in its own way, even if not as fun as just shooting my way through it. Simply starting off an action segment with shots already having been fired would have done a lot for me. Even then, the game should have had more combat sections either way, which is ultimately a bit disappointing. With the combat system so robust, so great, it can become quite frustrating not to be able to play around with it more. It was a common occurrence that I was nervously waiting for another opportunity to brawl it out in combat, only for that opportunity to either not come for a while or simply not last long enough. All this to say, yes, IO did manage to do it. I simply was not able to see the vision, which seems quite ridiculous in retrospect. Everyone else was right, and I was wrong. IO really was a great fit for developing a Bond game, and that doesn't just extend to the different types of gameplay alone. IO even manages to flex their storytelling chops, not just in the quality of the cutscenes, which are also a huge step up from Hitman in pretty much every way. The animation tech behind the game is doing it a lot of favors, but the writing and presentation are also many steps above what they attempted with Hitman. But the clear standout here, to me, are the characters.
Just can't help yourself, can you? I, for one, won't be sorry when you're gone.
Sir, this is on me. I decided to take the sparring outside of the ring.
First Light tells the origin story of how James Bond becomes a secret agent. After emerging from a crash landing as the sole survivor of a military assignment, Bond's comm tools are taken over by the MI6.
This is MI6. We're taking control of this mission, effective immediately.
Eventually James is commanded to retreat, leaving behind a lot of MI6 employees who are under threat from armed forces who have invaded their base, but Bond refuses to leave. He won't retreat into safety without having saved as many people as he possibly can. This is a very simple moment, but it's the exact kind of simple reason needed to make me root for him. Bond is an earnest hero here, and he continues to be throughout the game, in situations both less serious and even more damning than the one at the beginning of the game. Bond is shown to be supremely capable and intelligent throughout the entire game.
They absorb as much carbon as all the plants and trees on land combined.
Someone was paying attention in biology class.
He knows of political figures, he knows his science, he knows how to charm, he knows how to empathize with people.
I'm very sorry.
I don't need your pity.
And quite simply, knows how to be a good human being. Even when flirting, he doesn't come off as a sleazy asshole. He just appears as a guy who knows what he's got to offer and knows what he likes. There are a grace and effortlessness to everything he does that makes him cool in a way that is genuinely enjoyable. This even shows itself in how he traverses the game world and how he handles opponents. He's suave in his movement, even when simply exploring a scene. He's cool when he vaults over cover, when he takes out guards, or when he engages someone in conversation. The animations are doing a lot of the lifting in this regard. It cannot be overstated how natural the movement in First Light feels, especially compared to the recent Hitman trilogy. And not just in the way Bond moves, it's the nuances in their faces and performances. The animations carry this coolness and his character more than anything else, and the ability to convey it to this degree just had to be noted. In the end, Bond is a genuine standout and a lot more likable compared to how I have him pictured in my head. He's not toxically masculine, he isn't boringly stoic, he's a bit mischievous and smug, sure, but never unfoundedly so.
Here you go, sir. We call it King Chomp. The perfect infusion of heritage and creativity.
Sounds delightful. Chin chin, Moneypenny.
None of the decisions he makes in the game are ever portrayed to have been entirely wrong. Were the writers merely too short-sighted to account for Bond not being perfect, or was the point that he simply is that good? I'm not sure, but I choose to believe that he is just that good at what he does. But this also means that Bond barely develops. He keeps convictions throughout the entire game and never really questions himself, only others. The game even tells him,
Will you do me a favor?
Anything.
Don't let it change you.
even though this is an origin story, Bond as an iconic hero is already formed. The only thing about him that doesn't fit the James Bond myth is the iconography. The lack of suave suits, the lack of martinis, the lack of Aston Martins, not he himself. He is already at the point where I personally would expect Bond to be, even as an older, more experienced one. The thing is, this is pretty much true for all of the characters in the game. They don't change too much and they're pretty close to being as fully formed as we'd expect them to be. There isn't a lot of character development here, and what does happen isn't unpredictable or exciting in that sense, but it all works. It's all compelling and interesting enough in its own right. M is a woman married to the job that is willing to bend the rules and trust Bond. She might be newish in her role as head of MI6 and she's still under scrutiny of exterior forces, but she's got it and does not have to grow into her role too much. She, at least to me, always seemed like she knew what she was doing, as naive as she maybe was. Moneypenny in this game is a charming handler from the get-go, and not just a secretary to M. And while it does seem like Bond and her develop some kind of friendship over the course of the game, they are similarly friendly throughout. Their involvement over the length of the game leads to a multitude of fun moments, such as when she has to help out Bond mid-date, essentially forcing her to work out of a toilet during date night. And there's also, well, her reaction to one of the more classic Bond sequences.
Audio, James, still on. Tea time.
Q is already an older and much more established figure at the MI6 in this game. He's an incredibly charming man with a knack for technology, but also seems to have quite the appreciation for Bond. So much so that I'm pretty sure that he deliberately left the doors open for Bond to steal equipment from his lab later into the game, though with enough plausible deniability to not be blamed for it. But he also doesn't really change much, he's simply the experienced gadget guy from beginning to end. While characters being almost fully formed might be true for the classic Bond supporting cast, there are some exceptions in form of the characters that are entirely exclusive to this interpretation of Bond. As Bond gets recruited into MI6, he has to go through rigorous training under former 00 agent John Greenway, who essentially acts as a teacher to all the recruits and later a closer mentor to Bond. They, of course, butt their heads along the way, but learn to love each other in as tropey a way you'd expect. Then there are fellow 00 recruits Monroe and Cressida, both of them at the top of the class, who are tasked to bring Bond up to speed when he joins the training later than everyone else. They end up bonding over the course of the training and end up as a trio, even living alongside each other later on.
That poster should not go on our wall.
This is now our home, and our home needs things that really mean something.
Greenway and Bond's relationship is an entertaining example of a teacher-student relationship that, while not new, works perfectly well enough thanks to the entertaining banter and formidable character work on Greenway's side. While Monroe and Cressida work to show how nice of a friend Bond can be, but also to end up fueling his own convictions. Because this definitely will not have been a surprise to anyone, Monroe gets killed off pretty early on, which is an effective way of escalating the stakes of their first real mission that builds to perhaps the greatest moment in the game. Cressida doesn't die, but disappears from the game as she has to retreat from the 00 program after she ends up in a wheelchair. This might be the biggest wasted opportunity narratively, as she is not just the only remaining proper friend of Bond's, but also because of their shared trauma from that failed mission, her connection to one of the game's political string pullers, and the simple fact that she asks Bond to stay in touch even after everything. This is another point where I cannot be sure. Did the writers intend to imply that Bond was too distracted by the job to keep in touch with a friend, or did they simply not deem it necessary to have them interact again? Maybe they even cut a segment of them reconnecting out of the game. No matter what, I believe that there is more planned for her character. Cressida's return is also teased by supplemental dialogue stating that she will eventually be able to walk again, which might fulfill a narrative function in one of the subsequent games. While I really enjoyed how the characters were portrayed and how the game's plot progressed from moment to moment, I can't really say I really loved the story. It's perfectly enjoyable in its own right, but it does drop the ball somewhat by the ending. Even before that point, the story was quite formulaic and not too surprising, but it worked and felt completely in line with what I would expect out of a game or a Bond story like this. The game is quite long even, it took me about 16 hours to get through it. But the thing is, it could probably have ended quite a bit earlier. I already mentioned how some of the explorable areas get quite uninteresting later on. The game already struggles pacing-wise under the weight of its level design, but the narrative also struggles to keep up. The most interesting arc of the game is the relationship between Bond and Greenway, that, while formulaic, probably had the best example of character development within the game, with Greenway also being the most closely linked ally to the past events the entire story revolves around. Their arc ends about 2/3, maybe a bit later through the game, as Greenway dies during the pursuit of the game's villain, Damien Webb. This is immediately followed by a boss fight against Damien, which may as well could have been the final boss encounter, except that the game keeps going and he surprisingly reappears a couple of hours later, now wearing an exosuit and brimming with the need for revenge in order to justify the game having an even bigger final showdown. Nothing that happened in between that first boss fight and the final one really felt all that necessary, to be perfectly honest. Admittedly, there are still some things left unanswered at this point. The game could either have been rewritten to address this, or if it had to continue, I would have preferred things to escalate further. The game spends too much time with more open-ended Hitman-like sections during its final stretch that come nowhere close to the earlier ones. More action and less fluff could have gone a long way to both enhance the final stretch and at least make it fun to play, while also solving my issue with the final game not offering enough opportunities to enjoy its gunplay. As I've said, from moment to moment, most of the story works really well, even if it doesn't do anything unheard of. But the characters and the journey are compelling enough to carry the game, right until the point I've just described. I salute IO for giving it this much effort and genuinely delivering on the cinematic feel you'd expect of a game like this. But if there's one thing I'd hope for in the next game, then it'd be a more concise throughline, or even simpler, less fluff. First Light is almost perfect. The combat is incredible, the set pieces are bombastic, and the open-ended areas are fun to explore. Even the storytelling is quite compelling, and the characters in particular stand out with their charm, even if most of them don't go through too much development. Though that isn't anything I'd necessarily ask of a Bond story or a Bond game. In a way, I'd even call it refreshing that this origin story wasn't an excuse for Bond to get the Serf Dracula treatment. It's a shame that both the level design and storytelling run out of steam so close to the end. It's so much of a shame that it's quite easy for me to say that IO should probably have ended the game a couple of hours earlier. The game could quite easily have ended after Greenway's death and the first boss fight against Damien, but to its own detriment it just kept going. I never understood the sentiment that IO would be perfect, and I was never more happy to be wrong. When one of my biggest complaints is the lack of opportunities to enjoy the amazing combat of a game, then you can be quite certain that we're talking about a damn good game. And a damn good game 007 First Light is. IO really knocked it out of the park, so much so that I wouldn't complain if their next game was a 00 sequel instead of a new Hitman game. 5 years ago, I would never have believed that IO's Bond game would be so good that it would turn me into a proper fan of James Bond, the franchise and its characters. But that's exactly what happened.